So hello everyone, and welcome to another of our social cybersecurity working group meetings. We're delighted to have you here. Today I am very excited to introduce to you Dean Freelon. Deen is from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is part of the Hussman School of Journalism and Media, and I probably blew the name. But one of the things that makes his work really unique and very cool is that he combines kind of computational social science techniques with political science, political policy perspectives, with an understanding of communication and journalism. So his work has a very unique flavor that is very important in today's age. He's taught at a variety of places, including the American University in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, he's now at UNC, and he's also one of the leads there for this new center they've developed, a new interdisciplinary center on information, technology, and public life, CITAP or CITAP, and so on. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about Black Trolls Matter, and his work, of course, is extremely timely, and we are delighted to have him here. Dean, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Kathleen, and thank you everyone out there in Zoom land. I heard that this was supposed to be about 25 minutes, so I'm going to try to keep it to that, although I don't really have a clock that I'm looking at. So if I'm going too far over, somebody just be like, be quiet with questions, and then you can go ahead and ask those. So today I'm going to talk about some research that I've done collaboratively with several different groups of colleagues, specifically on the topic of social media disinformation. I'm going to talk about some studies a bit more in depth than others. There's going to be a little bit of a dump in terms of the amount of content that I'm throwing at you, but my hope is that at least something will catch your interest and we'll be able to discuss that as people's interests warrant. So I'm just going to go ahead and get into it because the Q&A is always my favorite part of these things. So I'll just go ahead and get started talking about disinformation. And I imagine that having read some of the promotional materials about this talk, you may already know or think you know something about disinformation, but I do feel like it's very important for me to define that at the outset because terms like these are thrown around, bandied about a bit too loosely these days. And so I do like to get very rigorous and conceptual when I talk about them. So I really like this definition that was created or written by the high-level expert group on fake news and disinformation of the European Commission in 2018. A really great definition. I've used it in several publications now, and that is all forms of false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promotion to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. Right. So what I like about this is it covers a wide range of kind of problematic information, which is another term that is used as a synonym for disinformation. This content, of course, in 2020 is often spread through social media. That's not the only way that it can spread, but that's one of the main vectors for the spread of this content. You'll also see this known as, or named as information operations, information warfare, propaganda, active measures is another term, especially when states are sponsoring the spread of this content. But I do want to also note that this is quite distinct from misinformation. And the main distinction between disinformation and misinformation is intent. So when you know that something is inaccurate or misleading and the intention is to cause harm or to generate profit, that's what makes it disinformation. So in other words, and of course, if you don't know, then it's misinformation when you're spreading it. And then at least potentially there could be a corrective if you were shown the truth, and then you might stop spreading it because then you realize that you're spreading it. So in other words, this disinformation is basically a relationship. Actually, if everybody mute their mics, somebody's got some noise on the line, so people can mute their mics. It'd be fantastic. Thank you so much. So the difference between disinformation and misinformation is basically a relationship between the individual spreading it to the content itself and how much they know about it and their intention in doing that spreading. So the work that I'm going to present today is about the Russian trolls and social media. This is probably the best known state-sponsored disinformation campaign. There's been a lot of press on it. And this is really just sort of a nice infographic that talks about it, right? What is a troll? I think, this is a term that goes back to at least the 1990s, if not before. But now we're talking about trolling on a national level, paid trolls, people who are trying to insert contents of disinformational provenance into national political discussions for the purposes of creating, division, polarization, and destabilizing the enemy. So in other words, it's information as weapon. This is why disinformation is considered one form of information warfare, along with, hacking and phishing and the rest of it, right? So the case that I'm looking at in all four of the studies I'm going to present today is the Internet Research Agency, of which many of you may have already heard. This is funded by the Russian government, operates out of St. Petersburg. They've been active on a number of social media platforms, including but not limited to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and some others. And in 2017, the U.S. House Intelligence Committee released a screen name for 2,752 IRA-linked Twitter accounts. They also released a bunch of Facebook data. Twitter released 1,000 more accounts for a total of 3,814 currently in accounts. I actually think the number is a little higher now. The slides are a little old, so I think the number is actually about 4,000 at this point. But that's sort of the basics on the IRA. And so I just wanted to show a little bit about what this looks like. Some of you may be familiar with some of these examples. Some of you may not, but I wanted to give a visual aspect of this, right? So you have some anti-Soros content over here on the left, right? So, Trump should put Soros on the FBI most wanted list for some reason. And then you've got the supposed war on Christmas on the right. If you take a look at the actual text, you can see that there are some very distinct solecisms in the writing, the kinds of grammatical mistakes that most English, native English speakers probably wouldn't make. A bit of a tell there, but then, hindsight is 20/20, right? So in other words, people who are kicking themselves for not realizing this in advance, need to sort of give themselves a break and realize that, when you don't know that there's a disinformation campaign going on, it's a lot harder to see that without that knowledge. Also, these are right-wing examples. And on the next slide, I'll show a couple of left-wing examples. And so these are a couple that were directed specifically at the Black community. So it's sort of Black left, the intersection of Black and left. So you have sort of, I won't vote with you, right? So this is opting out of the electoral system on political grounds, as opposed to, can't get around to it grounds. Do not vote for oppressors, same idea. And you can see the intention of voter suppression here, right? So, and voter suppression that specifically targets the Black community, which, as you may or may not know, disproportionately votes Democrats for Democrats in the United States. So this is one of the main purposes of at least IRA disinformation, which is to suppress, in this case, the Black vote. There are other messages that are intended to generally suppress anti-Trump votes as well. I'm sure that this is also ongoing as we speak, but all of this is from 2016. So the four studies I'm going to talk about today, there are, obviously within each study, there are a number of research questions. And so I've really tried to break down the central research or most important research question for each study. And so the first one, which actually is where the title, part of the title of this presentation comes from, is which types of IRA accounts receive the most attention, right? That's the Black Trolls Matter. So obviously the title gives away something of the results there. The second question is, what audiences paid most attention to IRA content and how were they connected? From a study that came out in the Disinformation Review a few months ago. To what extent did IRA content infiltrate the news media? I was a bit player on that one and the next one. That came out in the International Journal of Press Politics. And then finally, what attitudinal, because it also has behavioral effects there as well, did the IRA's campaign have? That one came out in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences. And so that one is another one where I was kind of on the tail end of the author list there. Very, very good research. I'll talk about that. Those latter two a bit more briefly than the first two. Here's a citation, and I can put this back up. All of these are published, and so you can read these papers. They all came out in 2020 or late 2019, so they're pretty recent vintage. This is actually the most recent one, and the one I want to talk about the most, because it's the one that I think actually has most relevance to what's been going on. And so this study is called Black Trolls Matter, Racial and Ideological Asymmetries in Social Media Disinformation, forthcoming in Social Science Computer Review. And so that'll be the first one that I will talk about. So I'm going to just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over a whole lot of things, but I'm going to start with the categories that we used in terms of putting these Russian trolls into categories based on what they talked about. So you have some of these categories that may be familiar to you if you've seen this content or if you've seen other research on the IRA. So you've got trolls that were reaching out to conservatives, right trolls, those that were interested in folks on the left side of the spectrum, left trolls. These specific categories were adapted from a category scheme developed by Linville and Walker of Clemson University. One of our contributions in the study is we broke out the black troll category from the left troll category, which Linville and Walker didn't do. And that actually ends up having major implications for the findings of this study. And so the ones on the left side of the chart over here, as you can see, are mostly are the primary political ones. The rest of them are less explicitly political. So if you see, for example, hashtag gamer, that would be something that is not explicitly political. You see them playing these little hashtag trending topic games on Twitter. You've got fear mongers, who are mostly spreaders of completely false news. Those that are not in English. Also, I'm seeing things popping up on chat, and I'll get to those later as I go through this. News feeds were accounts that pretended to be either news outlets and news aggregators. Commercial, which is sort of traditional spam, and then unknown, those that were impossible to classify. So this is just looking at unique users per category. You can see that non-English is by far the largest category. There have been some analyses of those non-English. The vast majority of those are in Russian. A bunch of unknowns. And then among the political categories, you can see that right trolls is by far the largest, having many more categories than left troll and black trolls combined. And then the rest of the categories are obviously smaller in terms of the numbers of accounts than that. Next up, we have tweet totals per category. And this actually shows some pretty big differences and also shows that the number of tweets per category does not really match up with the number of accounts per category. So you can see that among the categories that are in English, newsfeed actually has the vast majority of tweets. Among the political accounts, right troll developed the most tweets, and then left troll and black troll far less than right troll, and then the other categories are pretty low as well. So tweet counts definitely not evenly distributed across here, and that'll have some implications for some of the things I'll talk about later. And so these are some statistical models that I ran. They're actually model sets. I can talk more about this during Q&A, but due to the nature of the data set, this is 5.2 million tweets. I ran negative binomial regression models on these, but the models didn't converge given the speed of the data and also given the large size. And so I had to repeatedly sample from the different categories, the stratified sample from each account category. And then I was able to get nice little confidence intervals for my coefficients. And so what you're looking at here is the impact of being each one of these categories, and then there's a bunch of covariates down here at the bottom on retweet counts. And so I also ran each model twice, or each model set twice rather. And so the black dots are the models wherein black trolls were broken out from left trolls, and the red dots were the situations where black trolls were combined with left trolls. And so what you want to focus on is at the top of this chart, you see that the impact of black trolls when separated is much, much larger than left trolls without black trolls, as you see here. And what this dot, this red dot over here on left trolls shows is that the vast majority of the effect of left trolls is actually an effect of black trolls when black trolls are combined with left trolls. So in other words, this categorization, the methodological decision, in other words, to separate black trolls from left trolls has a huge impact on the results. Because when you do separate left trolls from black trolls, you see that the effect of left trolls is actually very similar to that of right trolls, right? So in other words, when they were combined, it looked like left trolls was this big driving factor. When you separate them, you realize it's actually black trolls driving that retweet effect. Looking at the rest of these, you can see, like, for example, most of the covariates didn't really have any effects. Actually, I meant to put the stars on here. significant effects, but I forgot to do that. But there were significant effects for having an image and a video as well. I didn't really theorize that a whole lot in the study, but there were interesting covariates and could be good areas or interesting areas for future research. So this is for retweets. I also did this for like models, likes, as well as replies, which is the next slide. But most of them basically have the same category, which is when you separate black trolls from left trolls, the effect of left trolls goes down a lot. And it looks a lot more and moves a lot closer to white trolls. So that categorization effect is pretty strong. But this one, and then of course we see image and video, persistent effect there. URL count actually has a negative effect. So in other words, there are fewer likes, the more URLs you end up including. That's enough. Here's the last model. The effect here is a little bit less clear, but you can still see generally when you take out the black trolls from left trolls, the coefficient for left trolls tends to move to decrease, to move closer to zero. So those are the basic findings there. And again, due to time, I can't get into all of the details, but I'm certainly happy to talk about that during Q&A if folks are interested in the gory statistical details on that. I also did an investigation of what is known as false amplification. So this would be the possibility where the IRA would actually be retweeting, replying to, and liking their own content. Well, actually just repeating and replying. I couldn't figure out the like piece of it, but I did look at retweets and replies, and I found that a little less than 3% of the IRA's retweets were provided by IRA accounts. About 1.27% of replies were also created by IRA accounts. So that's what was going on here. So a very small proportion of these retweets and replies were actually provided by the IRA. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of them were provided by real people, but it does show at least that within the scope of known IRA accounts, they were not spending a lot of time juicing their own stats, as it were. So this is good evidence, or some evidence that many of the vast majority of these other folks may have been, probably were real people interacting with this content. That's also consistent with what Twitter has said about how folks who are interacting with IRA content. So now I'm going to move on to the second study. And so this one was really about the IRA's audiences and how they were connected. The study is available in the Disinformation Review, the inaugural issue. This is collaborative research with Tanya Lockhart, who's at Dublin City University. So for this one, I also realized that I forgot to say anything about the data set for the previous study. So if you do have questions about the data set, I'm happy to answer those questions. But this data set, we downloaded over 2 million replies to IRA tweets over 9.5 years. We used network analysis, sorry, and community detection to find out audience overlap and details about how the audiences were separated. We also used Pablo Barbera's ideology detection algorithm to try to figure out the ideologies of the different, or the mean ideologies of different communities after we separated them. So here you've got a little network diagram I did here. These large circles represent each of the communities that were separated, and we did this using the Louvain method of community detection after generating networks based off of replies. So what you're looking at, the replies to IRA accounts. So you have 4 different right-wing communities of different sizes. The one that I call right 3 has Trump in it. The other ones, the 2 big ones and 2 smaller ones. You've got one for Black interests, another slightly larger one for left-wing interests, and then the width of the lines between them are the total number of shared replies from an individual in one community to an individual in another. These are technically directed ties, but it got a little too complicated when I tried to get the arrows going in opposite directions. So I just modeled them as an undirected network. And so you see also very sparse connections to the Russian cluster over here on the left, and that's probably due to the language difference. And then you see some very small communities down here, hashtag gamers, news, and health and diet. And this, of course, is consistent with the very small number of retweets that they got that was revealed in the previous interactions that they got was revealed in the previous study. So this is a look at IRA audience overlap. And so the y-axis on this is the percentage of internal replies. And so the higher the percentage of internal replies, the less engagement with other communities there was. And so Russian, obviously, again, this is sort of like a reality check, right? So the Russian language one had almost 100% internal replies, meaning very little engagement with other communities, which makes sense to me. Language barrier, health and diet, again, above 90%, and that's a topical difference, right? So if you're talking about health and diet, you're probably not talking about politics, and so that explains why there wouldn't be a whole lot of overlap there. You can see that the left and the black ones that are a little under 70% were generally pretty insular, along with hashtag gamers, but the ones that engaged with external communities the most were the right-wing ones. And so they were mostly engaged with each other. So they had a lot of overlap between them. News had a moderate amount of overlap at about 55%, but you see the overlap is sort of generating sort of a loose confederation of right-wing accounts. And then the other ones were overwhelmingly with an over 2/3 majority of internal replies on this one. And then the last thing we looked at in this study was ideology scores. And so what we did was we calculated an ideology scores, and these are based on who people follow. So we have a known list of individuals of different ideologies. So Trump would have a little right-wing ideology. Somebody like AOC would have a very left-wing ideology. It's on a scale of it's on a normalized scale centered on 0, and then of course positive numbers are right-wing, negative numbers are left-wing, and so. This is, again, just a reality check. You see that all the right-wing averages, these are results averages as well, skewed to the right, with the right-wing communities. Russian, slightly right. That one is in the lowest value because it's not really in English. News is right there on the center. Hashtag gamer, health and diet, left and black activists, all left of center. Right. So we see, in other words, that the ideologies of the individuals engaging with these Russian accounts match the famed identities of the Russians, right? So black activists are talking to black left-presenting IRA accounts, and those black activists themselves tend to mostly follow other left-wing accounts with known ideology, and the same is true for right-wing accounts engaging with right-presenting IRA accounts. Okay, so third one, 3 of 4. To what extent did the IRA change people's minds? Again, I was a bit of a bit player on this one. It's from PNAS. Came out in January. Very interesting and rigorous media effects study. And so I'm just going to go through the primary. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one. I provided some of the data for it, so I got to throw off ownership on it. But I do like talking about it because it's a pretty prominent venue when people have questions about this one. But I'll try to answer whatever questions you may have about this one and the next one as well as I can. But I was not involved in running the stats on that, so I'm somewhat limited in terms of what I might be able to speak to on that one. So methods here, you can read the paper for more details, but we did a 2-wave survey of an online panel of American partisans in November of 2017. Final N, just a bit over 1,200. There were Democrats and Republicans who used Twitter at least 3 times a week. We also got their Twitter handles so that we could reconstruct what kinds of IRA content that they may have been exposed to. So survey data linked with digital trace data from Twitter, very unique design that allowed us to analyze interactions with IRA accounts and their impact with the 2 waves on attitudinal behavioral measures. So I'm going to talk about a couple different results. I don't talk about everything, but these are predictors of IRA interaction. And so this is a binomial regression. You can see that the biggest predictor of IRA interactions is the percentage of co-partisans followed. In other words, if you follow people that share similar ideologies to you. So the ideology scores that we used here were very similar to the ones that were used in the previous study. And so if you follow a lot of people that were right-wing, you most likely interacted with a right-wing IRA account. While a lot of people from the left wing probably interacted with a left-wing account. A bunch of other variables, interest in politics, pretty close to 0 here. Most of these variables do cross over that 0 line, meaning not significant. Some sort of marginal south location effects for the south and north central regions. Not really sure what's going on there, but the biggest finding, of course, is the percentage of co-partisans following for this IRA election. This is the big one. These are effects on political attitudes and behavior. You can see due to the credible intervals here. This is Bayesian causal forest models, which full disclosure I didn't run. Don't totally understand them, but the the chart is actually pretty easy to understand. Those credible, 95% credible intervals do cross over that 0 point, which means there's no effect for any of these. So congratulations, PMAS, for publishing a study with a null effect. And so you look at change in opposing party feeling thermometer, change in desired social distance. This also came out before COVID-19, so this is like, actual social distance as defined, not related to any kind of epidemiological situation. Change in ideology, liberal conservative index, et cetera, very little effect. This is also consistent with what we know about media effects. Political ads, news, very, very small effects. And so it's totally consistent with the idea that the IRA didn't really change people's minds significantly through their social media interaction. The last thing I'll say about this before I move on is that the IRA can have other types of effects other than changing people's minds from one direction to another, which is something I'll discuss as I wrap up in the conclusion. Okay, let me just set the time real quick. All right, so this is the last one. So to what extent did the IRA infiltrate the news media, right? Very important question again. A bit of a bit player on this one, but an interesting study nevertheless. I did want to talk about it. This is forthcoming in the international. Oh, I guess it's already. Wow. They gave that one a volume issue number pretty quickly. Sometimes I have to wait years for that, but that's great. This was already officially out. You can check out the Peter et al. The International Journal of Politics. So what we did was we looked at 117 news outlets sourced from the data aggregator platform Media Cloud. We looked at 100 most repeated IRA candles or stories published in 2015 and 2017. We found 314 stories containing IRA references published by 71 outlets, which is 60.7% of all of the outlets. So the IRA was able to really push that message out to the majority of the top media outlets that we looked at. And there is the supplemental material. This article shows all of the media outlets we looked at. And so the IRA was able to get into the majority. And so the findings here is that we categorize these traditional media, digital native outlets, there are a couple other ones. It's mostly digital native outlets that incorporated the IRA content compared to digital media. About 80% of those incorporating IRA content were digital native. So the IRA accounts mostly provided opinion content. Sorry, I should say opinion content versus information only rather than opinion only. So 67% providing opinion content rather than information only. And then the IRA accounts mostly described as everyday people. That's where the vox populi and the top title of that study for. So they're presented as your average everyday citizen, which I'm sure is exactly what those disinformation agents at the IRA were looking for. And so this was one example of the media sort of getting hoodwinked by the IRA. So yeah, and the last thing I want to show for this is actually something that appears in the supplemental material of this article, but I wanted to pull it out because I didn't think it was interesting. This is the ranking of the most frequently of the news outlets that most frequently included IRA content. And I also just sort of coded this very briefly with an ideological slant. You can see that there are, you see left, right, and center. When I say center, I simply mean not having a self-declared ideology. I know many people think that like the Washington Post and Yahoo News and quote unquote the mainstream media are liberal, but they do have a balance of viewpoints on their editorial page and in their coverage, and so I sort of had that as center. So if you look at this, you can see that 5 out of the 10 were right-wing, 2 out of the 10 were left-wing, and then 3 were center. So it really wasn't just, oh, only the right-wing or only the left-wing. The IRA was able to worm their way into news outlets that covered the ideological spectrum in terms of what's going on here. And so that is I thought interesting finding here. You can see, so you've got Daily Caller, Breitbart, Washington Post, Yahoo News. Some of these you may recognize in the news, might not, but they were able to cast their net pretty wide, and it's not like they all exclusively were able to get into one side of the ideological spectrum in terms of the news outlets that infiltrated. Let me really quickly get into some conclusions here. We have Black presenting IRA accounts were highly effective in attracting attention, right, in the first study. IRA audience, the IRA largely did not engage in false amplification. The IRA's audience generally mirrored its feigned identity. In other words, conservatives are talking conservative presenting IRA accounts. Liberals or left-wingers are generally talking left-wing presenting IRA accounts. The IRA generally didn't change people's minds. And finally, The IRA extended speech beyond Twitter via a mix of left, right, center news media. So those are IRA specific. More generally, for digital disinformation, my conclusions are certain tactics and groups may be disproportionately effective and vulnerable. So the Black community is a case in point, right? With the protests going on right now, I'd be very surprised if there were not very concerted efforts to introduce disinformation via state-sponsored entities and other entities into the situation. Racial and ethnic type tensions here and elsewhere, maybe especially by exploitation. That's something that I think future research will really take a hard look at. Social media disinformation is not limited only to social media, right? It spreads, and so you can think of the news media here as super spreaders, right? You've heard this term in reference to COVID-19, but the news media, due to their increased reach relative to average users, can spread this content beyond social media. So the people who don't even have a Twitter account or even a Facebook account can still interact with it and still potentially be affected by it. And then the last conclusion that I had from the slide is, don't expect disinformation to change people's minds. That's consistent with what we know about media effects. But there are many other kinds of effects that we should explore, including, just to name two, increased polarization and extremism, voter suppression, as we saw on the visual slide earlier in the presentation, as well as potentially other ones. And I'd be very interested to hear about your thoughts about what those could be. So I'm going to pause there. Here's my contact information. And if you do have questions, I'd be very interested to hear those. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay, we want to open it up now to questions. And I want to start us off by, Deen, do you have enough understanding or hypothesis about what the persuasive tactics that are used to actually do voter suppression?
I think if you think back to that slide that I showed, earlier, that slide actually shows a couple of different. Actually, I'm going to back up to that slide just so that so I can show you. Now, obviously, this is not going to be valid at any kind of quantitative level, but I think it does show some examples of the rhetorical strategies that are used. One is kind of, you show a black face and say, I won't vote. That's kind of an in-group sort of appeal that says, well, black people shouldn't vote, right? So it's not for us. So don't do it. Look out for the group's interest and don't vote. So that's one, tactic. And then there's do not vote for oppressors, right? So it's look at how we've been oppressed in this country, sort of a Tweedledum and approach that you've seen not only in the black community but also in sort of the further reaches of the left for many years, and so that's not a race-specific appeal, but one that I think we've seen in many cases. So those are two examples of rhetorical strategies. Now, to be able to figure that out, I think you need to find out a way of sort of isolating those kinds of strategies. And just thinking about it in my head, I would love to have, say, a content analysis to do that. I'm not sure how well like a machine learning algorithm or something highly technical would be able to extract those kinds of high level tactics from, say, a tweet or even from an image that a person will be able to look at, or trained code will be able to look at and say, oh, that fits into this category, and then you could do a sample and do the rest of it in sort of traditional way. So that would be a basic research design that would get at that question.
Deen, this is Nitin from University of Arkansas.
Yep.
This is a very fascinating talk, and I'm just left wondering with so many new possibilities that can be done, that can be studied now from your findings. I had a question about the research question 2, I believe, which mentioned about audience ideology analysis.
Right.
So I was wondering if your analysis looked at how many of those audiences were bots or real humans, so as
okay,
to...
So that's a good question. So the panel came from YouGov, which is a very well-known provider of panel data, and so they were responsible for, and so they're used widely throughout political science. And so they made actual contact with these folks, and they had to take in their information to give them their incentives. And so they were given like, the equivalent of like $11 YouGov points, which they can then redeem for like Amazon, content and that sort of thing. So this panel company basically handled the determination, and they didn't simply look at somebody's Twitter account and enroll them. They actually got verification that these were real individuals, and that is really important. You don't want bots to contaminate your analysis, and so that's why we went with YouGov in terms of recruiting this panel. I see some things in the chat. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to try to do this.
Yeah, that was my next comment. We have some discussion on the chat, so maybe we can read up the questions or the comments from there.
Okay, I take the people trying to connect me. That's great. I'll focus primarily on the questions here. So are these outlets espousing these opinions, disinformation, or reporting IRA's disinformation? Let's see here.
Yeah, so this is Leah, University of Wisconsin. I had asked that. So you had the different media outlets, and what surprised me was Washington Post was in there. So the question would be, are these clearly, Breitbart and others might be espousing the viewpoints of this disinformation, but are some of those media outlets reporting on the IRA?
Okay.
There may be a distinction there.
So in the study, we actually stopped the study, the data. We actually specifically stopped the data collection prior to the revelation of the IRA's disinformation campaign, and so we were able to verify that not a single one of those news articles were reporting on them, and they all treated them as though they were real. So whether they were relying on the IRA's accounts, whether they were relying on the IRA's accounts for opinion or for information or for a mix of the two, they took them at face value, and at no point did they engage with them as disinformation, because those revelations didn't come out until after our study period ended, and that was by design.
Thank you. That's great. That's very helpful.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions that people have?
Then I might follow up with that. What was the Washington Post response then when they learned then that it was IRA content? Did they go back and post corrections? Did they check their methodologies going forward and how they check the veracity of what they were reporting?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. So that is not something that was included in the research. This study came out very recently. I'm not sure whether folks at the Washington Post have actually read it. I kind of doubt it, but I'm not sure whether they have changed their policies specifically. We do make recommendations at the end of the paper that news outlets should try to do a little bit more than just looking a tweet up and then pasting it into their article. Try to do a little bit more due diligence in trying to figure out or trying to ascertain that this is not somebody who is an account connected to any kind of disinformation campaign, state sponsored or otherwise. But I'm not aware of any editorial changes that have come about as a result of these inclusions.
Bill?
Hi, this is Phil from IU. Thank you.
Hi, how are you?
Great, how are you? Thanks for the great talk, and thanks to Kathleen, Nitin, and the South Hub folks for keeping inviting us outsiders. I have a forward-looking question. I like your final comment that just because we found that these campaigns did not change any minds, doesn't mean that they don't have an effect. And so, following up on Kathleen's question about voter suppression, how would we go about measuring that in the future? Like, could we have you given any thought about either panel type or other methodologies to look at whether these kind of campaigns can have an effect on voters? It seems to me like that's the low-hanging fruit in terms of, like, if I was trying to carry out a disinformation campaign and wanted to affect the elections, I would never try to change somebody's mind. I would just try to make so that certain groups are more likely to go to vote and others are less likely to go to vote. And your examples are very clear about that. So any thoughts about how can we measure impact of that kind?
Okay, that's a great question. My first thought about it is, I sort of have two suggestions, and they sort of map onto the traditional kind of research methods of inductive and deductive, right? So there is sort of a deductive path that you take that looks at the overall goals of disinformation in sort of a very abstract and high level way. So what is it that these disinformation agents are basically trying to do? And so you could take this from existing research on multiple disinformation operators. Voter suppression is well, actually, hold on for the voter suppression piece. That's actually part of the inductive piece. But so in other words, you think about disinformation as a component of information warfare. So inflicting damage on the enemy. How do you inflict damage on the enemy? You can without using bullets, right? So you can demoralize them, you can confuse them, you can make them doubt whether the content that's coming from their leaders is true or not. You can turn them against each other, divide and conquer. So all of these things are things that before you even look at any data, you're taking this deductive approach and you're being on the lookout for this stuff. Second piece is inductive. That's where you're looking at the data, you're saying, all right, let me take a look. So one just very, very sort of qualitative way to do this would be, let's take a look at, say, the 100 most frequently retweeted IRA tweets. And let's try to, divine, in other words, by looking at them, what are the tactics that they're really using here? So the examples that I gave, that I showed, are sort of part of that inductive approach, right? Where you're saying, okay, this is a very clear example of voter suppression. What else might they be trying to do? Some of the very sort of derogatory language that they use in reference to, undocumented immigrants, certain minorities, that is sort of trying to sort of get people upset at each other, trying to divide, right? So I think that sort of using those twin prongs, you really want to figure out what exactly they're doing. So in other words, all of this is taking place on the side of what is the attempt, and then you sort of go back to the kind of Dale et al. Method of two-wave exposure in the middle. What are the effects? Or even something. I mean, these kinds of studies are very. I mean, I think one of the reasons why this study was very interesting to do was because it was very serendipitous, because the study had already been run. It was run right around the time the IRA disclosures happened. So obviously, with the planning that went into it, it was just very fortuitous that we had this nice wave that the first wave that occurred. The IRA was still online. The second wave happened, and then all the stuff went away. So that's something that's very, very hard to plan for. And so we were able to capitalize on that to be able to do this very nice effect study. But so the other piece of this is you think about social media policies that mandate the removal of this content as soon as it's discovered, makes discovering these effects very, very hard to do. So there may be some sort of like post hoc type designs where I think you probably would have to get some sort of participation from Twitter or Facebook or the social media platform to do this, because I wouldn't really want to rely on people's memories of interacting with these folks. Oh wait, I just thought of something. Oh, thanks, so because on Twitter, for example, at least the replies of those users stay up, and this is just due to the technical quirk of the system, right? We downloaded a lot of those replies. I downloaded those replies a year after the IRA's disclosure, so you could actually follow up with those people, point to those replies and say, hey, well, I noticed that you did this, replied to this, what was kind of going through your mind? Now, obviously there's going to be some mnemonic degradation from a year later, but you would at least be able to say, we have verified evidence that you communicate with these folks. And then of course you've got the social desirability piece, which is, people don't want to look stupid, right? They don't want to look a dupe, and they don't want to look like they've been taken in by some disinformation campaign. So that will be another challenge in terms of trying to get people to talk about this honestly and saying, here's how I connected with it, and here's what I was thinking when I did it. So the memory piece and the social desirability piece, I think, are two sort of major hurdles to get over. And then, of course, the social media, delete everything as soon as you see it piece, I think all complicate this kind of research. But very, very well worth doing. So thank you, Phil, for that question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
So Dean, I have another question. The
Sure.
Measures that you used for black trolls, left trolls, etc. Do you think that they are easily translatable across media?
Yes, I do, because we looked at, so for the recoding, you can take a look at Linville and Walker's original paper in terms of how they categorize their accounts. But for us, so the only one we categorized was the black codes. So what we did is I said, we looked at the screen name and a random sample of 5 tweets. So if the idea was somebody should be able to make a positive determination of whether this is a black presenting account based on that. And if you can't, so to be conservative about it, in research terms, not political terms, if you can't make the determination, we're going to say that they're not. And so using that simple metric, we were able to determine that roughly half of the trolls that had originally been categorized as left trolls were, by our estimation, black trolls. So I think that by using a similar method across media, you could look only at, and so the other way to enhance that would be to have the avatars, right? So the visual presentation, which we didn't have. But simply on the basis of the screen name, how that was written, and a random sample of 5 messages, we were able to make that determination that half of those classified originally as left trolls were in fact black trolls by the definition of our study. So yeah, I do think that would translate across different studies, as long as you had the messages that were presented, the screen names, as well as ideally the avatars that were used.
So partly the strength of that was that it was all human done, not computer automated, right?
Yeah. So, but there were only like less than 4,000 accounts, so it wasn't that big of a deal. And the nice thing is, with the human coding, that gets a lot of things that I don't think machine coding will be able to do. Aspects of slang. If you train your model well enough, then it will do it. The other problem is that because the data set is so small, you don't really have a whole lot of training data, and so you have to rely on people's sort of knowledge of, what does black presenting mean in a textual way. And so if you had, potentially hundreds of thousands of these accounts, you might be able to sort of train a model well enough to perform on it. But with fewer than 4,000 and 9 different categories, you're sort of slicing and dicing pretty thin at that point for a really well done machine learning approach. But what that also does is it makes the approach a lot more attractive for human coders. So.
Okay, thank you.